The iron bars of the Otero County jail didn't just hold a person. They held the heat. A thick, wet heat that tasted like rusted metal and old regrets. Silas Thorne stood in the shadows of the hallway, his hat pulled low, listening to the slow, rhythmic drip of a leaky canteen somewhere in the back. He was 54 years old, with a face like a dried-up creek bed and hands that had buried more friends than he cared to count. He shouldn't have been here. A man like him, a man who had finally found a sliver of peace on a small ranch in the foothills, should have stayed clear of town. Especially a town owned by a man like Sheriff Miller. Before we'll continue, I want you to take your time and hit that subscribe button. It's help us and keep the tale burning. Let's begin. But then he looked into the cell. Clara stood by the small, high window, a single bar of moonlight cutting across her face. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. Her hair, once the color of autumn wheat, was matted with dust and dried blood. They said she'd killed the deputy. They said she'd stolen the payroll from the mining office. Silas knew better. He knew that the deputy had been Miller's man, and the payroll had never left the sheriff's desk. Clara was just the ghost they needed to pin the crime on before the circuit judge arrived at dawn. "Silas," she whispered. Her voice was a ghost of itself, thin and frayed like an old rope. He stepped closer, the floorboards groaned. Silas looked toward the front office. He could hear the muffled laughter of two deputies and the clink of a whiskey bottle against a glass. He had no gun. They'd taken his peacemaker at the door. He was just an old rancher coming to say goodbye to a neighbor. Or so they thought. Clara moved to the bars. She leaned her forehead against the cold metal. "Give me one last kiss before I die, Silas," she murmured, loud enough for the deputies in the next room to hear. "Just one. For the sake of better days." One of the deputies let out a low, mocking whistle. "Let the old man have his moment, Bill," the other laughed. "It's the last bit of sugar that girl's ever gonna taste." Silas leaned in. He felt the heat radiating off her skin, a fever born of fear and exhaustion. As his lips brushed hers, he felt her hand move. It was quick, precise. The movement of a woman who had learned to survive in a world that wanted her dead. She slipped a heavy, cold ring of iron into his coat pocket. The keys. She must have lifted them from Miller when he'd been gloating in her cell an hour before. He pulled back, his heart thumping like a trapped bird against his ribs. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just looked at her with the steady, unbreakable stare of a man who had already decided to go to hell and back if that's what it took. "Wait for the wind," he whispered. "If you're still here listening to this, you're the kind of person who knows that justice doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it wears a worn-out coat and carries a heavy heart." Silas is about to make a choice that will change his life forever. If you want to see how this fight ends, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep these stories of the Old West alive. Now, tell me in the comments, what time is it where you're listening from? Let's get back to the cell. The wind came 20 minutes later. It was a mountain wind, cold and sudden, rattling the shutters of the jailhouse and kicking up a veil of dust that turned the street outside into a gray blur. It was the only cover Silas would get. The lock turned with a heavy, oily click. Silas didn't waste words. He swung the door open and caught Clara before she could stumble. She was lighter than he expected, like a bird with a broken wing. He wrapped his wool coat around her, covering the tatters of her dress. "Can you ride?" he asked. "I can ride until I drop," she whispered. They didn't go out the front. Silas had spent the afternoon loosening the boards on the back supply room. They slipped out into the alleyway, the smell of rain and horses hitting them like a blessing. Silas's big bay was waiting, tied to a rotted hitching post 2 blocks over. He lifted her onto the saddle, then climbed up behind her. He could feel her trembling, her back pressed against his chest. "Hold on," he said. They didn't gallop. Galloping made noise. They walked the horse through the shadows, staying off the main planks, moving like ghosts through a town that was too drunk on its own power to notice them leaving. It wasn't until they hit the tree line at the edge of the valley that Silas gave the bay its head. The horse lunged forward and the darkness swallowed them whole. By the time the sun began to bleed over the horizon, they were miles deep into the red canyons. The air was thin and sharp. Silas pulled the horse to a stop in front of a hidden line of boulders. Behind it sat a cabin that hadn't been on a map in 30 years. It was a place for men who wanted to be forgotten. He helped her down. Her legs gave out the moment her boots hit the dirt. Silas caught her, his arms locking around her waist. He didn't ask if she was okay. He knew she wasn't. He carried her inside and laid her down on a cot that smelled of cedar and dry wool. He didn't build a fire, not yet. Smoke was a signal. Instead, he fetched a basin of water and a clean cloth. He sat on a stool beside her, his joints stiff from the ride. He began to wash the dirt and blood from her face. He worked slow, careful. The way a man works when he's trying to mend something that's been shattered. "Why did you do it, Silas?" she asked. Her eyes were open now, watching him in the dim light. "You had a quiet life. You were finally safe. Healing takes time, but out here in the West, time is a luxury the law doesn't give you." Silas and Clara are catching their breath, but the storm is rising behind them. If you've ever had to stand up for someone when it would have been easier to walk away, let me know in the comments. I read every one of them. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the final standoff. Pour yourself another cup of coffee, and let's see what happens when the dust settles. 3 days passed. 3 days of quiet that wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that feels like a held breath. Silas didn't spend the time resting. He cleaned his old Winchester until the lever moved like silk. He checked the perimeter. He watched the way the birds flew. Birds told you when men were coming long before you could hear the hooves. Clara began to move again. She helped gather firewood, her movements slow but determined. She didn't hide in the corner. She sat at the table and watched Silas. She saw the way his hand went to his hip where his gun should have been. She saw the scars on his shoulders, reminders of a war he never talked about. On the 4th morning, the birds went silent. Silas was out on the porch, whittling a piece of oak. He stopped. He stood up, the Winchester already in his hand. He didn't have to look at Clara. She was already standing in the doorway, her face pale but her jaw set like stone. "How many?" she asked. "4," Silas said, squinting at the ridge road. "Miller and 3 deputies. They're riding hard." He motioned for her to go inside. "Stay under the floorboards, Clara. The trapdoor in the kitchen." "No," she said. Her voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was sharp. "I'm done hiding in holes, Silas. I spent my whole life being told to disappear. If this is where it ends, I'm standing in the light." Silas looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, a spark that no jail cell could put out. He gave a slow, grim nod. He didn't try to argue. He knew a warrior when he saw one. He handed her a small, blunt-nosed revolver he kept in the rafters. "Make your shots count," he said. The riders pulled up 50 yards from the cabin. Sheriff Miller sat on a white horse that looked too expensive for a man on a lawman's salary. He had a greasy mustache and eyes that looked like they were made of glass. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a man who had forgotten the difference between a badge and a brand. "Thorne," Miller shouted, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "You're harboring a fugitive and a murderer. Step aside and give us the girl, and maybe I'll let you keep your dirt patch ranch." Silas stepped off the porch. He didn't take cover. He stood in the middle of the yard, the Winchester resting across his arms. "She's not a fugitive, Miller," Silas called back. "She's a witness. And I think that's what's really bothering you." Miller's face twisted. He didn't come to talk. He reached for his holster. Silas didn't wait. He moved with the speed of a man who had spent his youth in the trenches. He fired. The first shot took the hat right off the deputy on Miller's left. The man yelped and dove from his horse. Gunfire erupted from both sides, the sound cracking like thunder in the narrow canyon. Silas felt a hot sting across his ribs, but he didn't flinch. He leveraged another round, his eyes locked on Miller. From the doorway, a smaller bark of a revolver joined in. Clara was firing from the porch, her shots forcing the deputies to scramble for cover behind the boulders. It wasn't a long fight. Men like Miller are used to bullying people who can't fight back. When the lead starts flying for real, their courage tends to leak out like water from a cracked jar. Silas moved forward, step by step, his rifle barking rhythmically. He was a wall of oak and iron. One deputy went down with a leg wound. Another saw Silas's face, a face that looked like death itself coming for him, and he turned his horse and fled back down the ridge. Miller was left alone, his horse spooked and dancing. He tried to aim his pistol, but his hands were shaking too hard. "It's over, Miller," Silas said. He was 10 feet away now. The barrel of the Winchester was pointed right at the sheriff's heart. "Drop it." Miller looked at Silas. Then he looked at Clara, who was standing on the porch, her revolver leveled at him. He saw the truth in her eyes, the truth that she wasn't a recover from the mining office the night they broke out. It was all there. The stolen money, the bribes, the names of the men Miller had paid to keep quiet. The marshals took them away as the first stars began to blink into existence. The cabin was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet now. It was heavy, but it wasn't haunted. Silas sat on the porch steps, a bandage wrapped around his ribs. His hands were steady as he cleaned his rifle one last time. Clara came out and sat beside him. She had changed into a clean shirt of his, the sleeves rolled up past her elbows. "You're bleeding," she said softly. "I've had worse," Silas replied. He looked out over the valley. The land looked different tonight. It looked like it belonged to them. "Where will you go?" he asked. Clara looked at her hands. The bruises were still there, but the shaking had stopped. "The marshals said they need me in Topeka for the trial. After that, I don't know. I don't have a home to go back to." Silas kept carving. He didn't look at her, but his voice was soft. "A ranch is a big place for an old man to run by himself. There's fences to mend, horses to train. And I've found that the coffee tastes better when there's someone across the table to tell me it's too bitter." Clara didn't answer right away. She leaned her head against his shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but after everything they'd been through, it felt like a vow. "I like bitter coffee," she whispered. "Maybe that's what the West is really about. It's not about the gunfights or the gold. It's about the moments when two broken people decide they've had enough of running. It's about the decision to stand still and open the door, even when the storm is howling outside. How many folk out there are sitting alone, thinking their story is over? Sometimes all it takes is one decision, one act of kindness, one last kiss that turns into a new beginning. If this story meant something to you, give it a like. Share it with someone who needs to know that healing is possible. And if you want to hear more stories of